So welcome back to our first lecture in political geography, which is looking at the foundations of political geography. And I want to ask, what is political geography for? But I want to start with an illustration. At the moment, we are currently in a US presidential election. And to be honest, it's not the greatest example of the civilized democratic process underway. Around this time last year, last US presidential election, before Donald Trump was elected, the public policy polling organization in the US asked a broad sample of Democratic and Republican primary voters whether they would support the US bombing of Agrabah. Now, nearly a third of Republican respondents said they would, versus 13% who opposed the idea. In contrast, Democratic preferences were reversed. 36% were opposed, but 19% were in favour. Now, I wonder if you know where Agrabah is. Agrabah doesn't exist. It's the fictional country in the 1992 Disney film Aladdin. Now, when these results were published, liberals crowed that it showed the Republicans just had aggressive tendencies. And conservatives counter that it showed that Democrats had a sort of reflexive pacifism. But what I think is really important, really significant, is that 43% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats polled had an actual defined view about bombing a place that only exists in a cartoon. and political geography at its basic level is providing a better understanding of the world to help us live better in it. But knowledge is never neutral. Knowledge always comes from a certain position. And to illustrate this, I want to look at the most palpable example of geographical knowledge, maps. And I'm going to show you a series of maps over time and ask us what they tell us about the world. So the first map is a reconstruction of a map drawn by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, discovered in the medieval period. And it shows a basic understanding of connectivity between Europe, Asia and Africa, as we'd call them, focused on the European Mediterranean world. The second map is a so-called TO map, medieval map. And it's called a TO map because it shows the continents of Europe, Asia and Africa, spreading out like a T, and Jerusalem as the O, the centre in the middle. And of course, this was a Judeo-Christian worldview. Jerusalem, the city of where Jesus died and rose again, becomes the centre of the world in this worldview. Third map is a map again from a medieval period, 6th century AD, it's reckoned at, and it again shows this basic idea of Europe focused on at the centre of the world and Mediterranean Europe and the three continents spanning out from it. If we move on to the 16th century, we have the famous map by Gerardus Mercator. He was a Dutch map maker and he created a map that was very useful for navigation. It showed the correct shape and outline of countries and territories, which was useful for navigation. But what it distorted, because remember, any flat map always has distortions, it distorted the correct size of the world. And so in the second half of the 20th century, Arnold Peterson created this map, which is a corrective map, which shows the correct relative sizes of the world. Relative sizes of different countries in the world. But of course, this map it still shows that just as the early European maps did and Gerhardt's map, Mercator's map did, Europe is at the centre and in the middle. It's reflecting this Eurocentric view of the world. And so in the 1970s, MacArthur made his universal corrective map, putting Australia at the top and in the middle. And MacArthur was, of course, an Australian. And there was a little poem at the edge of the map. And it said, "So spread the word, spread the map. South reigns, South is superior. Long live Australia, ruler of the universe." So he, of course, making the point that traditional map making has placed Europe at them as most important. The next map shown is a cartogram rather than a map, and this shows this is basically a graph that divides a variable up and shows and each item on this graph is the proportionate size to that country's share of that variable. And in this case, it's energy consumption. It's an extraordinary map, isn't it? It can show how Europe and North America and parts of East Asia have a vastly disproportionate share of energy consumption, and Africa and much of South America largely disappear. It's making a political point, in a way, about energy consumption. The next map is a map called The Gap, and this was produced in the early 2000s by a strong supporter of George W. Bush's invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And he divided the map into two. And he said this. He said that most of the world is in globalization. And these are the countries where you have democracy and capitalism and human rights and everyone is happy. But it is possible, he says, to fall off the bandwagon called globalization and you become part of the gap. And he shows this distinction on his map through pale and embossed spaces in the world. He said if you fall into the gap, then trouble will follow. And if you're lucky, he says, so will US troops. So you can see this is a way of understanding the world through the lens of American and European civilizational advancement, and it's a way of justifying invasion and war. Next map is from a book by Robert Ferrino some years ago, and it's about a dystopian post-apocalyptic United States. And he uses this map to show how to illustrate how his world could be differently after a nuclear war. Similarly, the next map is by Evangeline Evarista. She is a very important novelist in Britain at the moment. She wrote a book a number of years ago called Blonde Roots, and it imagined the transatlantic slave trade as it existed particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, reversed, and so the victims of slavery being white Europeans and the perpetrators of slavery being black Africans. And she uses this map to illustrate and illuminate her idea. It's a very thought-provoking book to make you think about slavery and racism. And the last map I want to show is a map is an example of a map that's using mockery, in this case mocking Donald Trump, to make fun of his geopolitics and his view of the world. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of those maps. As political geographers, I'm sure you love maps. And maps are representations of what we think the world does, how we think the world looks, or what it should look like. And so is political geography. There is a politics and geography of political geography. So write this down as you make notes. It's the most important part of this first theme. There is a politics and a geography of political geography. Where political geographers lived, the times in which they lived, the places and the ideas that influenced them, influence the way that we make and write and teach political geography. And just as maps have changed with time, they've changed as technology develops and as our understanding of the world develops and as politics develops, so has political geography. And we are going to be tracing that in this first theme this week. And so the rest of this lecture theme, and also the theme next week, when we're looking at more recent times, will be to understand where the discipline of political geography is coming from so we can understand it today. And it's focused very much on Anglo-American political geography. Unfortunately, there is not space to explore different traditions here. I hope you'll see how interesting this is. You'll meet some real heroes and villains of political geography, but it'll also help you as you understand this module and as you do your assessments. So again, the key point is there is a politics and geography to political geography, and we will now go on to unpack that in these remaining sections.
I would like to introduce you now to this theme's guided reading. Traditionally in lectures, we'd give you the lecture, then you'd go home and do the reading later. But what I want to do is incorporate the reading into the different videos. So what I suggest is that you don't go on and watch the next video as part of this theme, but you do the guided reading. And the guided reading is this. On the screen, you'll see the two articles that I'd like you to read this week. These two articles are classics of political geography, and I'm going to be discussing them in some detail in the next lecture theme. So if you've read them now at this stage, you'll get the most from it. So what I'd like to ask is that you read each of these two articles, which are available via library reading lists on the Canvas webpage. You read these two articles, and as you read them, you ask yourself two questions. The first is, what is the main argument of each of these? And the second, which do you like best and why? Now, as you read them, make notes. If you write it up on a computer or on paper, that's fine. Put the full bibliographic details at the start, the reference, as you can see on the screen here, and then make notes throughout the article, and then reflect on these two questions and make notes on them. What is the main argument of each of these? And which do you like best and why? So this will be useful both for the next video in this theme, but also for the synchronous live discussion group that we'll have to conclude this theme. So I hope that you will choose to engage with this reading at this stage. It'll be much more useful for you than reading it afterwards.